Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to this slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is purely a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify the time that I use on it thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you're finding it useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to help keeping it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, please go take a look at the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that helps me keep the lights on and can get you bonuses based on your contribution level. So go up there, take a look, and sign up if you're interested. And of course, if monthly is a big ask, which I completely understand, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. And you can help the show out without having to do so financially by just telling people about it. Help spread the word, help Sleepy Time Tales reach a new audience, and that's all I can really ask for. That's enough of that. Thank you very much. Let's get on with the show. We return this week to a history of art for beginners and students, painting, sculpture, architecture, by Clara Erskine Clement Waters, and we pick up in the discussion of the work of Leonardo. After a time, misfortunes overtook the Duke, and Leonardo was reduced to poverty. Finally, Il Moro was imprisoned, and in 1500 Leonardo returned to Florence, where he was honorably received. He was not happy here, however, for he was not the one important artist. He had been absent 19 years, and great changes had taken place. Michealangelo and Raphael were just becoming famous, and they, with other artists, welcomed Leonardo, for his fame had reached them from Milan. However, he painted some fine pictures at this time. Among them were the Adoration of the Kings, now in the Uffizi Gallery, and a portrait of Ginevra Benici, also in the same gallery. This lady must have been very beautiful. Ghirlandaio introduced her portrait into two of his frescoes. But the most remarkable portrait was that known as Mona Lisa del Giocondo, which is in the Louvre, and is called by some critics the finest work of this master. The lady was the wife of Francesco del Giocondo, a lovely woman, and some suppose that she was very dear to Leonardo. He worked upon it for 4 years, and still thought it unfinished. The face has a deep, thoughtful expression. The eyelids are a little weary, perhaps, and through it all there's a suggestion of something not quite understood, a mystery. The hands are graceful and of perfect form, and the rocky background gives an unusual fascination to the whole picture. Leonardo must have loved that picture himself, and it is not strange that he lavished more time upon it than he gave to the great picture of the Last Supper. Leonardo sold this picture to Francis I for $9,000, which was then an enormous sum, though now one could scarcely fix a price upon it. In 1860, the Emperor of Russia paid $12,000 for St. Sebastian by Leonardo, and in 1865 a Madonna by him was sold in Paris for about $16,000. Of course, his pictures are rarely sold, but when they are, great sums are given for them. In 1502, Caesar Borgia appointed Leonardo his engineer and sent him to travel through central Italy to inspect his fortresses. But this usurper soon fled to Spain, and in 1503, a painter was again in Florence. In 1504, his father died. From 1507 to 1512, Leonardo was at the summit of his greatness. Louis XII appointed him as painter, and he labored for this monarch also to improve the waterworks of Milan. For 7 years he dwelt at Milan, making frequent journeys to Florence. But the political troubles of the time made Lombardy an uncongenial home for any artist, and Leonardo, with a few pupils, went to Florence, and then on to Rome. Pope Leo X received him cordially enough, and told him to work for the glory of God, Italy, Leo X, and Leonardo da Vinci. But Leonardo was not happy in Rome, where Michealangelo and Raphael were in great favor. And when Francis I made his successes in Italy in 1515, Leonardo hastened to Lombardy to meet him. The new king of France restored him to the office to which Louis XII had appointed him, and gave him an annual pension of 700 gold crowns. When Francis returned to France, he desired to cut out the wall on which the Last Supper was painted, and carry it to his own country. This proved to be impossible, and it is much to be regretted, and it is probable that if it could have been thus removed, it would have been better preserved. However, not being able to take the artist's great work, the king took Leonardo himself, together with his favorite pupils and friends and his devoted servant. In France, Leonardo was treated with consideration. He resided near Amboise, where he could mingle with the court. It is said that, although he was so much admired that the courtiers imitated his dress and the cut of his beard and hair. He was given the charge of all artistic matters in France, and doubtless Francis hoped that he would found an academy as he had done at Milan. But he seems to have left all his energy, all his desire for work on the Italian side of the Alps. He made a few plans, but he brought no great thing to pass, and soon his health failed and he fell into decline. He gave great attention to religious matters, received the sacrament, and then made his will, and put his worldly affairs in order. The king was accustomed to visit him frequently, and on the last day of his life, when the sovereign entered the room, Leonardo desired to be raised up as a matter of respect to the king. Sitting, he conversed of his sufferings, and lamented that he had done so little for God and man. Just then he was seized with an attack of pain. The king rose to support him, and thus, in the arms of Francis, the great master breathed his last. This has sometimes been doubted, but the modern French critics agree with the ancient writers to give this account of his end. He was buried in the church of St. Florentine at Amboise, and it is not known that any monument was erected over him. In 1808, the church was destroyed. In 1863, Arsène Houssaye, with others, made a search for the grave of Leonardo, and it is believed that his remains were found. In 1873, a noble monument was erected in Milan to the memory of Da Vinci. It is near the entrance to the Arcade of Victor Emmanuel. The statue of the master stands on a high pedestal in a thoughtful attitude, the head bowed down, and the arms crossed on the breast. Below are other statues and rich bas-reliefs, and one inscription speaks of him as the renewer of the arts and sciences. Many of his writings are in the libraries of Europe in manuscript form. His best-known work is the Trattato della Pittura, and has been translated into English. As an engineer, his Canal of Mortisano was enough to give him fame. As an artist, he may be called the poet of painters. And if those who followed him surpassed him, it should be remembered that it is easier to advance in a path once opened than to discover a new path. Personally, he was much beloved, and though he lived when morals were at a low estimate, he led a proper and reputable life. His pictures were pure in their spirit, and he seemed only to desire the progress of art and science, and it is a pleasure to read and learn of him, as it is to see his works. Other good artists of the Lombard school in the 15th century were Bernardino Luini, about 1460 to 1530, who was the best pupil of Leonardo, Giovanni Antonio Beltraffio, 1467 to 1516, Gaudenzio Ferrari, 1484 to 1549, Ambrogio Borgnon, whose works dated about 1500, and Andrea Solario, whose age is not known. We return now to the Florentine school at a time when the most remarkable period of its existence was about to begin. We shall speak first of Fra Bartolomeo, or Baccio della Porta, also called Il Frate, 1469 to 1517. He was born in Savagno and studied at Florence under Cosima Rosselli, but was much influenced by the works of Leonardo da Vinci. The painter became famous for the beauty of his pictures of the Madonna, and at the time when the great Savonarola went to Florence, Bartolomeo was employed in the convent of San Marco, where the preacher lived. The artist became the devoted friend of the preacher, and when the latter was seized, tortured, and burned, Bartolomeo became a friar, and left his pictures to be finished by his pupil Albertinelli. For 4 years he lived the most austere life, and did not touch his brush. Then his superior commanded him to resume his art, but the painter had no interest in it. About this time Raphael sought him out, and became his friend. He also instructed the monk in perspective, and in turn Raphael learned from him. For Friar Bartolomeo was the first artist who used lay figures in arranging his draperies. He also told Raphael some secrets of colors. About 1513, Bartolomeo went to Rome, and after his return to his convent, he began what promised to be a wonderful artistic career. But he only lived 4 years more, and the amount of his work was so small that his pictures are now rare. His Madonnas, saints, and angels are holy in their effect. His representations of architecture are grand, and while his works are not strong or powerful, they give much pleasure to those who see them. Michealangelo Buonarroti was born at the castle of Caprese in 1475. His father, who was of a noble family of Florence, was then governor of Caprese and Chiusi. And when the Buonarroti household returned to Florence, little Angelo was left with his nurse on one of his father's estates at Settignano. The father and husband of his nurse were stonemasons, and thus in infancy the future artist was in the midst of blocks of stone and marble, and the implements which he later used with so much skill. For many years, rude sketches were shown upon the walls of the nurse's house, made by her baby charge. At the proper age, Michealangelo was taken to Florence and placed in school. But he spent his time mostly in drawing, and having made the acquaintance of Francesco Granacci, at that time a pupil with Ghirlandajo, he borrowed from him designs and materials by which to carry on his beloved pursuits. Michelangelo's desire to become an artist was violently opposed by his father and his uncles, for they desired him to be a silk and woolen merchant and sustain the commercial reputation of the family. But so determined was he that finally his father yielded, and in 1488 placed him in the studio of Ghirlandajo. Here the boy of 13 worked with great diligence. He learned how to prepare colors and to lay the groundwork of frescoes, and he was set to copy drawings. Very soon he wearied of this, and began to make original designs after his own ideas. At one time he corrected a drawing of his master's. When he saw this, 60 years later, he said, "I almost think that I knew more of art in my youth than I do in my old age." When Michealangelo went to Ghirlandajo, that master was employed in the restoration of the choir at Santa Maria Novella, so that the boy came at once into the midst of important work. The scaffolding and all that belonged to it, with the painters at work thereon. When his master saw it, he exclaimed, "He already understands more than I do myself." This excellence in the scholar aroused the jealousy of the master, as well as of his other pupils, and it was a relief to Michealangelo when, in answer to a request from Lorenzo de' Medici, he and Francesco Granacci were named by Ghirlandajo as his two most promising scholars, and were then sent to the academy which the Duke had established. The art treasures which Lorenzo gave for the use of the students were arranged in the gardens of San Marco, and here, under the instruction of the old Bertoldo, Angelo forgot painting in his enthusiasm for sculpture. He first copied the face of a faun, but he changed it somewhat, and opened the mouth so that the teeth could be seen. When Lorenzo visited the garden, he praised the work, but said, "You have made your faun so old, and yet you have left him all his teeth. You should have known that at such an advanced age there are generally some wanting." The next time he came, there was a gap in the teeth, and so well done that he was delighted. This work is now in the Uffizi Gallery. Lorenzo now sent for the father of Angelo, and asked that his son might live in the Medici palace under his own care. Somewhat reluctantly, the father consented, and the Duke gave him an office in the custom house. From this time, for 3 years, Angelo sat daily at the Duke's table, and was treated as one of his own family. He was properly clothed, and had an allowance of 5 ducats a month for pocket money. It was the custom with Lorenzo to give an entertainment every day. He took the head of the table, and whoever came first had a seat next to him. It often happened that Michealangelo had this place. Lorenzo was the head of Florence, and Florence was the head of art, poetry, and all scholarly thought. Thus, in the home of the Medici, the young artist heard learned talk upon all subjects of interest. He saw there all the celebrated men who lived in the city or visited it, and his life, so near Lorenzo, for thoughtful youth as he was, amounted to an education. The society of Florence at this time was not of a high moral tone, and in the year in which Michealangelo entered the palace, a monk called Savonarola came to Florence to preach against the customs and crimes of the city. Michealangelo was much affected by this, and throughout his long life remembered Savonarola with true respect and affection, and his brother, Leonardo Buonarroti, was so far influenced that he withdrew from the world and became a Dominican monk. Michelangelo's diligence was great. He not only studied sculpture, but he found time to copy some of the fine old frescoes in the Church of the Carmine. He gave great attention to the study of anatomy, and he was known throughout the city for his talents and for his pride and bad temper. He held himself aloof from his fellow pupils, and one day, in a quarrel with Pietro Torrigiano, the latter gave Angelo a blow and crushed his nose so badly that he was disfigured for life. Torrigiano was banished for this offense and went to England. He ended his life in a Spanish prison. In the spring of 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died. Michealangelo was deeply grieved at the loss of his best friend. He left the Medici palace and opened a studio in his father's house, where he worked diligently for 2 years, making a statue of Hercules and 2 Madonnas. After 2 years there came a great snowstorm, and Piero de' Medici sent for the artist to make a snow statue in his courtyard. He also invited Michealangelo to live again in the palace, and the invitation was accepted. But all was so changed there that he embraced the first opportunity to leave, and during a political disturbance fled from the city with 2 friends, and made his way to Venice. There he met the noble Aldobrandeo of Bologna, who invited the sculptor to his home, where he remained about a year, and then returned to his studio in Florence. Soon after this, he made a beautiful sleeping Cupid, and when the young Lorenzo de' Medici saw it, he advised Michelangelo to bury it in the ground for a season, and thus make it look like an antique marble. After this was done, Lorenzo sent it to Rome and sold it to the Cardinal Riario and gave the sculptor 30 ducats. In some way, the truth of the matter reached the ears of the Cardinal, who sent his agent to Florence to find the artist. When Michelangelo heard that 200 ducats had been paid for his Cupid, he knew that he had been deceived. The Cardinal's agent invited him to go to Rome, and he gladly went. The oldest existing writing from the hand of Michelangelo is the letter which he wrote to Lorenzo to inform him of his arrival in Rome. He was then 21 years old and spoke with joy of all the beautiful things he had seen. Not long after he reached Rome, he made the statue of the drunken Bacchus, now in the Uffizi Gallery, and then the Virgin Mary sitting near the place of the cross and holding the body of the dead Christ. The art term for the subject is La Pieta. From the time that Michelangelo made this beautiful work, he was the first sculptor in the world, though he was but 24 years old. The Pieta was placed in St. Peter's Church, where it still remains. The next year he returned to Florence. He was occupied with both painting and sculpture, and was soon employed on his David, one of his greatest works. The statue weighed 18,000 pounds, and its removal from the studio in which it was made to the place where it was to stand, next to the gate of the Palazzo Vecchio, was a difficult undertaking. It was at last put in place on May 18, 1504. There it remained until a few years ago, when on account of its crumbling from the effect of the weather, it was removed to the Academy of Fine Arts by means of a railroad built for the purpose. About this time, a rivalry sprang up between Michealangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. They were very unlike in their characters and mode of life. Michealangelo was bitter, ironical, and liked to be alone. Leonardo loved to be gay and to see the world. Michealangelo lived so that when he was old, he said, "Rich as I am, I have always lived like a poor man." Leonardo enjoyed luxury and kept a fine house with horses and servants. They had entered into a competition which was likely to result in serious trouble when Pope Julius II summoned Michealangelo to Rome. The Pope gave him an order to build him a splendid tomb, but the enemies of the sculptor made trouble for him, and one morning he was refused admission to the Pope's palace. He then left Rome, sending this letter to the Pope. "Most Holy Father, I was this morning driven from the palace by the order of your holiness. If you require me in future, you can seek me elsewhere than at Rome." Then he went to Florence, and the Pope sent for him again and again, but he did not go. Meantime, he finished his design and received the commission that he and Leonardo had striven for, which was to decorate the hall of the Grand Council with pictures. At last, in 1506, the Pope was in Bologna, and again sent for Michealangelo. He went and was forgiven for his offense, and received an order for a colossal statue of the Pope in bronze. When this was finished in 1508, and put before the church of St. Petronio, Michealangelo returned to Florence. He had not made friends in Bologna. His forbidding manner did not encourage others to associate with him, and we now know from his letters that he had great trials. His family was poor and all relied on him. Indeed, his life was full of care and sadness. By 1508, he was again summoned to Rome by the Pope, who insisted that he should paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Michealangelo did not wish to do this, as he had done no great painting. It proved to be one of his most famous works, but he had a great deal of trouble with it. On one occasion, the Pope threatened to throw the artist from the scaffolding. The Pope complained also that the pictures looked poor. To this the artist replied, "There are only poor people whom I have painted there. and did not wear gold on their garments. His subjects were from the Bible. When the artist would have leave of absence to go to Florence, the Pope got so angry that he struck him. But in spite of all this, the great painting was finished in 1512. Grimm, in his Life of Michealangelo, says, "It needed the meeting of these two men, in the one such perseverance in requiring, and in the other such power of fulfilling, to produce this monument of human art." It is impossible here to follow step by step the life and works of this great master. Among other great things which he did were the tomb of Julius II in the church of St. Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, of which the famous statue of Moses makes a part. He made the statues in the Medici Chapel in the church of St. Lorenzo in Florence, the painting of the Last Judgment on a wall of the Sistine Chapel, and many works as an architect. For he was called upon to attend to fortifications both in Florence and Rome. And at last, as his greatest work of this sort, he was the architect of St. Peter's at Rome. But as it now is, Michealangelo may be counted as its chief architect. His works are numerous, and only a small part of them is here mentioned. But I have spoken of those by which he is most remembered. His life, too, was a stormy one. For many reasons that we have not space to tell. While he lived, there were wars and great changes in Italy. He served also under 9 popes, and during his life 13 men occupied the papal chair. Besides being great as a painter, an architect, and a sculptor, he was a poet, and wrote sonnets well worthy of such genius as his. His whole life was so serious and sad that it gives one joy to know that in his old age he formed an intimate friendship with Vittoria Colonna, a wonderful woman who made a sweet return to him for all the tender devotion which he lavished upon her. Italians associate the name of Michealangelo with those of the divine poet Dante and the painter Raphael, and these three are spoken of as the 3 greatest men of their country in which they are called the modern day. Michealangelo died at Rome in 1564, when 89 years old. He desired to be buried in Florence, but his friends feared to let this be known, lest the Pope should forbid his removal. He was therefore buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, but his nephew, Leonardo Buonarroti, conveyed his remains to Florence secretly, disguised as a bale of merchandise. At Florence, on a Sunday night, his body was borne to Santa Croce in a torchlight procession, and followed by many thousands of citizens. There his friends once more gazed upon the face which had not been seen in Florence for 30 years. He looked as if quietly sleeping. Some days later, a splendid memorial service was held in San Lorenzo, attended by all the court, the artists, scholars, and eminent men of the city. An oration was pronounced. Rare statues and paintings were collected in the church. All the shops of the city were closed, and the squares were filled with people. Above his grave in Santa Croce, where he lives near Dante, Machiavelli, Galileo, and many other great men, the Duke and Leonardo Buonarroti erected a monument. It has statues of painting, sculpture, and architecture, and a bust of the great man who sleeps beneath. In the court of the Uffizi, his statue stands together with those of other great Florentines. His house in the Ghibelline Street now belongs to the city of Florence, and contains many treasured mementos of his life and works. It is open to all who wish to visit it. In 1875, a grand festival was held in Florence to celebrate the 400th anniversary of his birth. The ceremonies were very impressive, and in that time some documents which related to his life and had never been opened were by the command of Victor Emmanuel given to proper persons to be examined. Thus it is that the great deeds of great men live on and on, through all time. And it is a joy to know that though the 69 years of the life of this artist had much care and sorrow in them, his name and memory are still cherished, and must continue to be, while from his life many lessons may be drawn to benefit and encourage others. Lessons which we cannot here write out, but they teach patience, industry, and faithfulness to duty, while they also warn us to avoid the bitterness and roughness which are blemishes on the memory of this great good man. Daniele del Volterra, 1509 to 1566, was the best scholar of Michealangelo. His principal pictures are the Descent from the Cross in the Church of Trinita del Monte in Rome, and the Massacre of the Innocents in the Uffizi Gallery, both are celebrated works. The next important Florentine painter was Andrea del Sarto, 1488 to 1530. His family name was Vanucci, but because his father was a tailor, the Italian term for one of his trade, unsato, came to be used for the son. Early in life, Andrea was a goldsmith, as with so many artists. But when he was able to study painting under Pietro di Cosimo, he became devoted to it, and soon developed his own style, which was very soft and pleasing. His pictures cannot be called great works of art, but they are favorites with a large number of people. He succeeded in fresco painting and decorated several buildings in Florence, among them the Scalzo, which is a place where the barefooted friars held their meetings, and was named from them as they are called Scalzi. These frescoes are now much injured, but they're thought his best works of this kind. Probably Andrea del Sarto would have come to be a better painter if he had been a happier man. His wife, of whom he was very fond, was a mean, selfish woman, who wished only to make a great show, and did not value her husband's talents except for the money which they brought him. She even influenced him to desert his parents, to whom he had ever been a dutiful son. About 1518, Francis I, King of France, invited Andrea to Paris to execute some works for him. The painter went and was well established there and very popular, when his wife insisted that he should return to Florence. Francis I was very unwilling to spare him, but Andrea dared not refuse to go to his wife. So he solemnly took an oath to return to Paris and bring his wife, so that he could remain as long as pleased the king. And then that sovereign consented. Francis also gave the artist a large sum of money to buy for him all sorts of beautiful objects. When Andrea reached Florence, his wife refused to go to France, and persuaded him to give her the king's money. She soon spent it, and Andrea, who lived 10 years more, was very unhappy, while the king never forgave him. And to this day this wretched story must be told, and continues the remembrance of his dishonesty. After all he had sacrificed for his wife, when he became very ill in 1530 of some contagious disease, she deserted him. He died alone and with no prayer or funeral, was buried in the convent of the Nunziata, where he had painted some of his frescoes. His pictures are very numerous. They are correct in drawing, very softly finished, and have a peculiar grey tone of colour. He painted a great number of holy families, one of which is called the Madonna del Sacco, because St. Joseph is leaning on a sack. This is in the convent where he is buried. His best work is called the Madonna di San Francesco, and hangs in the tribune of the Uffizi Gallery. This is a most honourable place, for near it are pictures by Michealangelo, Raphael, and Titian, and other great painters, as well as some very celebrated statues, such as the Venus de Medici and the Dancing Faun. Andrea del Sarto's pictures of the Madonna and Child are almost numberless. They are sweet, attractive works, as are also his of St. Barbara, St. Agnes, and others of his single figures. And I'm going to leave it there because we're moving from Florence to Rome, and there's going to be a whole new set of things. So I'm going to call it there for tonight. If you'd like to pick up where we're leaving off, as always, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you can get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.